Should we speak of colonialism and slavery in the same breath as if they were the same thing? Now, one of the weird tensions that emerges for me there, and I've tried to think this through clearly, I'm reading at the moment a multi-volume history of slavery put out, I think, by Cambridge University Press. And my sense historically, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong here, is that slavery is a ubiquitous feature of human societies. And the conscious realization that slavery itself is intrinsically wrong, even in the case, let's say, of prisoners of war or debt or debtors, that notion emerged with great difficulty, and it manifested itself most profoundly in the UK, probably in the person of Wilberforce, who and the Christian Protestant evangelists who made a very strong case that slavery itself was intrinsically immoral. And the consequence of that was eventually that the British Navy fought for about 175 years on the high seas to make slavery a counterproductive enterprise. And one of the things that sort of terrifies me about the radical leftist enterprise is that they really risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because whatever it was that impelled Wilberforce and then the entire UK to stand against slavery is the only thing we know of in the entire history of the world that actually did stand against slavery with any degree of success. So what other cases do you think can be made that colonialism and slavery were not the same thing? And why do you think there is this insistence on the radical left side to deny the very process that actually did free slaves insofar as they've become free in recent times?
So, Jordan, I think the identification of colonialism with slavery is similar to the 1619 Project in the United States, which identifies the foundations of the US with fundamentally racist and therefore fundamentally illegitimate. I think what's happened is that probably through Black Lives Matter, the killing of George Floyd in 2020 in Minneapolis, Black Lives Matter movement came across the Atlantic with no change of clothes, landed in Britain, and our equivalent is to say contemporary Britain is systemically racist, and the reason we're systemically racist is that we continue to revere our colonial past, let's say, by having a statue to Cecil Rhodes. And as we all know, colonialism was essentially about slavery, which was based on a racist view of Africans as subhuman. So colonialism equals slavery equals racism, and that's the foundations of Britain. And that's why we have to repudiate our colonial past, pull down Cecil Rhodes, pull down John A. Macdonald in Canada, and somehow, therefore, we liberate ourselves from systemic racism. And that's the logic behind the colonialism and slavery mantra. So in this country, those two things are commonly talked about as if they were the same thing. And my very simple point in that second chapter is to say, wait a moment, as you've just said, Jordan, yes, for 150 years, some British people, by no means all, were involved in slave trading and profiting from slavery in the West Indies. But from 1807 onwards, and then 1833, first the slave trade, then slavery itself were abolished by the British. And for the rest of the empire's existence, for another 150 years roughly, the British were involved in anti-slavery. So you cannot identify British colonialism with slavery, because for the second half of its life, it was anti-slavery. And yes, slavery in one form or another, and some forms were more humane than others, has been around since virtually the dawn of time, practiced on every continent by black and brown and red-skinned and yellow-skinned people as well as white-skinned people. The Comanche nation in the southwest of the US ran what one historian has called a vast slave economy in the 1700s. The Arabs were involved in slavery. Africans were selling African slaves to the Romans and the Arabs before they ever sold them to Europeans. So you know, we may be dismayed at the fact that so many Europeans and British people up until the late 1700s accepted this institution and the fact of slave trading. But we have to put it in context. Everyone did it. including slaves who escaped from the plantations in Jamaica into the forested interior. Some of them kept slaves of their own, so common was the practice. So yes, what happened in the late 1700s was that for the first time in history, some nations, not just Britain, also Denmark and France, came to the view that owning other people as your property without them having any rights was morally abhorrent. And for the first time in history, these nations, eventually led by Britain, abolished the slave trade and slavery. And then Britain used its imperial power, for humanitarian purposes, to abolish slavery from Brazil across the Atlantic, across Africa, India to Malaysia. So power can be a good thing, and in that case, it was used for humanitarian purposes. The irony here is, Jordan, as you suggested just before I started speaking, the irony here is, in that case, the empire and those humanitarians who were lobbying for the imperial power to be used to suppress slavery, they were the progressive people of their day.